All right. Well, welcome everyone. I'm Jennifer Statham from the Indian Education for All unit at the Montana Office of Public Instruction. Welcome to our third Indian Education for All Ethnobotany webinar with Marissa Spang. I sure am excited to hear her presentation this evening, so thank you so much for joining us. Welcome everyone. We have many from near and far joining us this evening. This is a webinar series created for Montana's pre-K through higher ed teachers. Please bear that in mind as you listen to the presentation, and also questions from the Q&A will be posed to the presenter in the order of relevance to classroom instruction. For those of you joining us from outside of Montana, I'd like to give a brief history of Indian Education for All. In 1972, Montana became the first state as it revised its constitution to enact a law called Indian Education for All, stating that all Montanans, regardless of age and background, be taught about the distinct and unique cultural heritage of each Montana tribe. In the Indian Education for All unit at the Montana Office of Public Instruction, we create resources and professional development opportunities such as this to support K-12 Indian Education for All in meaningful, respectful, and tribally specific ways in all content areas. I would also like to give a land acknowledgement. In the spirit of healing, I acknowledge and honor the original peoples of the southwestern Montana, Helena, Montana area, the Salish, the Blackfeet, the Kootenai, and other tribal nations, Crow, Northern Cheyenne, Chippewa Cree, Nez Perce, Nakota, Dakota, Little Shell, Assiniboine, Shoshone, and the many Indigenous peoples who call it home, past, present, and future. We are in a webinar format, so we will have Q&A. If you have any procedural questions, sign-in questions, please do put those in the regular chat, and then we will address the Q&A portion towards the end of the webinar. If you do have a burning question, please do throw it into the Q&A, as I will be monitoring that, and I will make sure to get that question to Marissa. Again, the sign-in sheet, it's just fine to sign in and chat unless you are seeking Montana teacher licensure renewal units, then make sure to get onto that sign-in sheet. It is open and I see people are signing in, but it is only necessary if you would like renewal units. And the feedback survey, we will also post that link. It's also in your reminder letter. And so the feedback survey will open up the last 10 minutes of the webinar, and then it will only be open for 24 hours. So please make sure to get those feedback surveys in. And thank you all so much for completing these feedback surveys. Even if you aren't seeking renewal units, having this feedback is extraordinary, and it's really fueling further efforts so that we can continue producing such series in the future. So thank you so much for your efforts and your very thoughtful feedback. And we do actually read through every single one. So let me get to the introduction, though. It is my great pleasure to introduce my very dear friend, Marissa Spang. Marissa obtained her bachelor's in Native American Studies from Dartmouth College and her master's of Education and Learning Sciences and Human Development from the University of Washington. She has contributed to the STEM Teaching Tools Project with another one of my favorite Native educators, Megan Bang. She currently teaches high school in her Cheyenne homelands at Lame Deer High School, as well as offers courses through Montana State University. Her work actively attends to the storied and lived collective continuance of Indigenous peoples by Indigenous peoples, particularly in the context of everyday human repair, repatriation, and practice of respectful relations with the natural world by employing Indigenous sciences and ontologies, while also finding ways to adapt and integrate Western science. And I just know that Marissa has taught me so much over the years, and I really valued her friendship, and I'm just delighted to have you here with us tonight, Marissa. Thank you so much.
Hi, Jennifer. Thank you so much for that introduction and that welcome. It's such a pleasure and honor to be with you all this evening in this virtual space. How rewarding it would be to be convening in person. And, I know we're all wishing and hoping for those days to return, hopefully sooner than later, but balancing that with the reality of this pandemic that we are still currently in. And we're all doing our best to keep the circle full and to maintain the strength of our circle around Indigenous knowledge and science education and education in general. So I just want to say thank you all to everybody for joining us this evening. I will go ahead and provide my presentation. And I know that there's a kind of a pretty straightforward format to this. I'll walk through my presentation, and if there's questions, and please, as questions arise, I know that I kind of work that way too, as you know, a speaker is saying something, it generates a question for me. So feel free to write that down or put it in the chat. I really want to make sure that this session is as helpful to you all as possible. I definitely want to present some things that I think are important considerations around Indigenous knowledge, Native science, and plant knowledge. And I also know that we are learners of all of this knowledge and that we are at different places or stages in our preparation for this knowledge. So please feel free to push out your questions as they might come to you, and I'd love to answer them at the end. Okay. So good evening. Again, my name is Marissa Spang. My Cheyenne and Crow name is Buffalo Woman, or Child of the Buffalo. That was given to me by my grandmother, my late grandmother, Evelyn. It was something she had provided to me later on in my life. And with it comes a lot of responsibility. And mostly what I take away from my name is that I belong to the land and I belong to the buffalo. I'm a child of them, and with that comes, certain responsibilities, and I do my best to live into those. And it's my sort of theory or story of my life as an Indigenous woman, to be a learner, a steward, a practitioner, and a sharer of Indigenous knowledge. And as I will make clear, hopefully in my presentation today, we all have a responsibility to becoming Indigenous to place, and a lot of that involves knowing the Indigenous knowledge to which the lands we do live upon and make home in. And so with that, why don't we go ahead and jump in? So my screen is showing a little funny when I try to go into full presenter mode, so I'm hoping that everybody can see my slides in this sort of live edit mode. If there are any issues, Jennifer, please do let me know. And so today with our session, I'm going to discuss native plants, primarily Northern Cheyenne and Crow knowledge and uses of plants through a two-pronged approach. First, I'm going to talk about Indigenous story or Indigenous theory, and then how you go and live or apply this Indigenous knowledge. And the reason I'm doing that, and purposely doing that, is because Indigenous story and Indigenous knowledge are these very intentional and reciprocal pieces to what it means to know Native knowledge or Native science and what it means to practice it. And so they are in this iterative reciprocal relationship, constantly providing feedback to each other for the purposes of improving our ability as humans, as a species, to give back to our relations, not just our human relations, but to non-human and to the land as a whole. It's my goal today to not only provide a larger storied understanding of Native plant relatives, but to also offer some practical methods or skills for how to live into or practice what I refer to as kinship-based relationships with Native plant relatives, and how you can do this in your classrooms. And what I'm going to demonstrate for you now, it's kind of an implied messaging that I'm trying to model here, but it becomes really important to Indigenous pedagogies, Indigenous knowledges, that you acknowledge the lineage and the inheritance you come from. And so I deeply acknowledge that I come from generations of Northern Cheyenne and Crow peoples who have lived on this land for thousands of years. And it is due to their work and the lives that they've lived and the languages they've spoken that I get to come to be here today. And I really love this image here because I feel like if I were to open my heart or look at the inside of my heart, I feel like this is what it would look like. And this is a picture of the Tongue River in southeastern Montana, close to present-day Northern Cheyenne Reservation. And it just has gifted me so much and given so much to me and allowed me to grow and evolve my relationship and orientation to place and to land, and almost kind of been a teacher and a mentor, a safe place to learn these Native knowledges, and then giving me the inspiration and the strength to then go out and try to share these in good ways. And so I look at land and my ancestors as, my original teachers. And a part of that ancestral knowledge and that ancestral inheritance includes Chief Dullknife. He's also referred to as Chief Morningstar amongst the Northern Cheyenne. He lived approximately 1810 to 83. And he had several wives, and one of his wives was Pawnee woman, and she is or was Pawnee. And so we descended through Morningstar and Pawnee woman. And I'm what you would refer to as a sixth generation of a chief's family through my dad, or more specifically through my dad's mother, my grandmother. And there are enormous responsibilities to this lineage. And if I were to say it in just a few words, it's about serving the people and about serving the land. And, we don't get born into these things and knowing exactly how we are to be or what we are to do in this life. And it's actually a huge piece of Cheyenne ontology to learn what it means to be human while we're here. And so I try to grow into this as much as I can, and lean into it as much as I can and grow it, and share that out, because it's my responsibility. It's a big piece of serving the land, of exercising our knowledges, because if I were to put it into a short, quick example, we've been here for, thousands of years, and we've been successful. We've developed these sophisticated, deep, complex knowledge systems that have allowed us to be on land and to be in these kinship-based relationships for thousands of years. And that's a big task. And so you don't get to learn all of that automatically. It's something that you attend to as a lifelong kind of responsibility. And so I take that really seriously. And this is something that was always shared with me by my grandmother, my dad's mom, about making sure that you live into these responsibilities as a member of a chief's family. And here you can see two of my grandmothers on the left photo. That's my grandma Barbara, that's my dad's mom, and that's her sister Dolly. And I just showed some more photos here that shows my grandma and my parents, my grandma with some of her grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Just to show you that how rich and how significant family is to what it means to be Northern Cheyenne and what it means to be Crow. To acknowledge on my Crow side through my mother, I'm also a descendant of Pretty Shield, who lived around 1856 to 1944. So she kind of somewhat overlapped with Chief Dullknife's life, but I don't think they interacted with each other. All I'm saying is that they lived within the same period, but as he was ending towards the end of his life, she was just this young girl who was growing up. And she was about 11 years old when the Crow Reservation was established. And these two ancestors that I'm talking about played such a significant role in our history because they lived during a time during a rapid and drastic and violent change that was, predicted. If you look to, Crow knowledges and Crow visions, as well as Cheyenne, you will see within those knowledges that it was predicted that huge changes were coming. And so this isn't something that was not anticipated. However, I do think the change is unprecedented. I don't know of a larger change than this in our histories and trajectories as Northern Cheyenne and Crow people. And so it's calling upon us to adapt in new ways, and to make sure that we're still living into those ethical relationships to land and with each other. And I can only imagine if I were to take the perspective of Pretty Shield at the time, who was only 11 years old, who, up until that time was living in a time where she still got to live what it meant to be Crow, not saying we're any less Crow today, but that she and others before her, and this includes Dullknife too, although a separate tribe, got to live what it meant to be Indigenous to land, to go with our migration and our different seasonal places that we would visit and the ceremonies we would hold. And now she's this 11-year-old child. So you think about that, you all are teachers and we work with children every day. An 11-year-old's mind to now say, well, you can't do that anymore. You're living within these restricted boundaries of what is your homeland now. And at that time, Northern Cheyenne and Crow people needed permission. They literally needed a piece of paper that came from a white man that said that they were civil enough to leave the reservation and go off the reservation. And so we're talking about such a rapid change in lifestyle. And in spite of that, Dull Knife and Pretty Shield and others like them went on to live their lives. And one of the things that I take away from Pretty Shield's story is that she was this amazing ethnobotanist, this amazing native scientist, even though we wouldn't put it into those words at that time. But she still proudly raised her children and grandchildren on the Crow reservation. She acted as a doctor and as a midwife to many. And it is through that knowledge that she hung on to, that she practiced, that not only gave us a present at that time as Crow people, but also the future, and looking to me and my daughter and those after us to make sure that we are still here and that we're still practicing this knowledge. Here's a few photos more of, this is my grandma Evelyn here, and over here, who, is the descendant of Pretty Shield. And here we are with all my sisters and my mother. And then another photo of Pretty Shield here. So I also just wanted to highlight more of my teachers who I've come to know in this lifetime and acknowledge them. And hopefully I do my best by representing what they've taught me, because I don't come to this knowledge by myself, and nor has it been about myself, nor will it ever be about me. And I want to acknowledge Linwood Tallbull here on the left side. He is a Cheyenne ethnobotanist. On the bottom, below that picture is Linda Black Elk, who's also an ethnobotanist. These are just incredible individuals, incredible human beings. And I definitely encourage you to look into their work more, and you will be really inspired by what you find there, to deepen your practice around Native knowledge, and particularly with plants. And this goes for everybody on this slide. I've also had the pleasure of being mentored by Dr. Megan Bang, who right now is a professor of learning sciences and human development at Northwestern, amongst many other things. And she at the time was at University of Washington as my mentor, and that's a picture of us on graduation day, and I'm adorned in a traditional Crow Alptooth dress. And on the right here, as you all are probably familiar with, is Dr. Robin Kimmerer. And I've been fortunate enough to spend a couple of days with her up on the Flathead homeland a couple of summers ago, and something that I really treasured. And of course, I constantly look to her work in my own classrooms when I go to design science learning environments that integrate Native knowledge and Western knowledge. Okay, so this, the slide is I apologize if this slide's a little overwhelming. These were supposed to pop up one at a time. That's how I had designed it. But since I can't go into presenter mode, just bear with me. Let's go to the first quote on here. So we really want to get into talking about what is Indigenous story or Indigenous theory. And what I mean when I go to talk about this is very well represented through the words on this slide. And so Dr. Brian Brayboy is another amazing Indigenous scholar out there. I definitely encourage you to look into his work as well. He says that theory is not simply an abstract thought or idea that explains overarching structures of societies and communities. Theories through stories and other media are roadmaps for our communities and reminders of our individual responsibilities to the survival of our communities. He elaborates on that by saying stories are not separate from theory, they make up theory, and stories serve as a way to orient oneself and others toward the world and life. And Dr. Joanne Archibald another amazing Indigenous scholar in Canada. Definitely look into her work. I didn't highlight it on my resources. I should have, but she does definitely have a great book out called Indigenous Story Work. You'll definitely want to get your hands on that. And she says that stories can guide the development of our heart, mind, body, and spirit. So Indigenous story or Indigenous theory isn't just about this like philosophical practice in like the academy. And I mean, it can exist there, right? It can, and we have incredible people doing that work and making that space. At the same time, it doesn't exist merely for that sort of exercise, right? It's more about being a more practical roadmap for how we might go about living our lives, about how we might go about articulating our ontologies, about what it means to be human, articulating why we're here. And it is through those sorts of stories that we form directly within the land that go to inform who we are to be, either as a Cheyenne person and Crow person, Lakota, etc. Right? And so let me go to the next slide, trying to bring us around here. And as I'd mentioned earlier, if we think about this Indigenous story, or Indigenous theory, another way of talking about it or labeling it is kind of like this storied indigeneity. And then it's in this sort of reciprocal iterative relationship with the everyday, like basically the living of our indigeneity. So it's one thing to kind of story what it means to belong to land, what it means to be Indigenous. And then it's quite another to then go practice it and live it. And so as Indigenous persons, we have this responsibility of not only storying and creating sophisticated story or theory about indigeneity or what it means to be here, but then we also have to kind of live it and apply it. And we take what we've learned from that application or from that livedness of our indigeneity and reapply it back into story. And so this is what is beautiful about Indigenous knowledges, is that they are not static. And they grow and they're highly contextual. They're highly contextual and attend to what is happening in a particular place, time, land, etc. And it's not to say that previous knowledge is not still a part of the Indigenous knowledge. It most certainly is. It's just that that's one of the incredible sophisticated things about Indigenous knowledge, is that it can be really quickly adaptable to context, and a huge strength of what Indigenous science holds for all of us. So let me go into an example here with what Cheyenne Story or Cheyenne Ontology would tell us. The first line here says that we are spirits having a human experience. And so for Cheyenne, you know, this isn't the ultimate life. This human form is not the ultimate life, but that we actually originate from somewhere else. And now we have manifested to this human form. And we're here then as the spirit in this manifested human form, having this human experience. And so it becomes our lifelong responsibility to learn, to story, to learn, and to practice what it means to be human. And so this is deeply connected to not simply to story what this means, but also live it in an ethical relationship with all of our kin, not just humans, not just learning what it means to be in ethical relationship with another human or another human society. It's really about all the societies, human and non-human. And so again, this was supposed to kind of float in piece by piece here, but let's go ahead and just take this top part. It says that, you know, if we go to apply this then to what is a kinship-based relationship, taking this, let me go back a slide, what this Cheyenne story or ontology means, like in practical terms, right? And this isn't easy knowledge. Like this isn't something that we should be grasping onto right away. It takes time, it takes space, it takes practice, and it takes attending to relationships, and something I'm still doing. And again, it becomes this lifelong process, right? So if you're still kind of working with it, awesome. That's all you can do. And that's what I tell my students is like, this might kind of feel overwhelming or not making sense or not quite landing yet. And that's okay. Because a big piece of Indigenous knowledge is, you know, revisiting and renewing ourselves and our knowledges and our relationship to these knowledges. So just be patient with yourself. Okay, so if we look about this in terms of a kinship-based relationship, it would say that according to Cheyennes Story, then we all have this responsibility. We all have this responsibility of learning what it means to be human and practicing that as a lifelong responsibility. And carrying that kinship-based relationship with all kin, not just humans. We're talking human, non-human. We're talking rocks, we're talking water, air, soil. And if we were to kind of say this another way, really what it comes down to is that we must all become indigenous to place. And a part of this means ethically practicing indigenous sciences or indigenous knowledges. And I want to pause here a little bit with this because one of the things I've often heard, and Jennifer brought this up with me too, is just to make sure that to answer this question of non-native folks about how to like culturally or, you know, like to do it appropriately about how to integrate native knowledge into your classrooms. And there is a deep history behind that. There is deep skepticism that has been rightfully earned on the part of Indigenous peoples, because what has happened is that Indigenous knowledges have been exploited, appropriated, and utilized by non-native individuals, organizations, researchers to further their research or to publish a book and make money off of that Indigenous knowledge in the form of a book. So that is for real. Like that still exists to this day. There's a deep history of that, and unfortunately it still happens today. And you know, there's two brilliant Native women scientists, Indigenous women scientists I know, who just, you know, within the past few months gave me examples of how their work was being appropriated by their colleagues, and how their ideas were being presented as an original thought or idea or original work of a non-native colleague, and a non-native colleague was actively doing that. And so these things are for real, because if we're looking into these colonized institutions of higher education, it doesn't carry with it the same axiology or the same value system of what it means to be a steward of Indigenous knowledge. And I talk about this like with my students as well, with my high school students, because they need to be really prepared and kind of primed for these differences. Otherwise, they'll be left questioning, why is it this way, and why is it that way? And I'm trying to lead them out of the weeds a little bit so that they can see the whole landscape for what it is. And this stuff happens for real. And so I do struggle with this, honestly, with myself. And at the same time, my skepticism or fear of our knowledge being exploited, I guess, isn't enough for me to not share it. I guess that's kind of where I'm at with it. And I still acknowledge the problematic nature of Indigenous knowledge getting appropriated and exploited. But really what it is for my hope and to live into that chief's responsibility is to put this out there and to try to trust it with the people and trust it with the land, and trust that all of this will come back full circle, and that ultimately this knowledge feeds out into our relations about us going around being here in this lifetime, and learning and practicing what it means to be human through Indigenous knowledge or Indigenous science. And so that's why I really emphasize the word ethically here, is because there is an ethical practice to Indigenous knowledge for sure, but it's not so much in a way where it's like, oh, you're non-native, you don't get to practice native knowledge. It's not that black and white, it's not that simple. And where's my slide? I may have put it at the end here. So this was such a great quote that Dr. Kyle White, another phenomenal Indigenous scholar you definitely want to look into, especially he's taken up work around Indigenous knowledge, science, and climate change. Phenomenal scholar, so you'll definitely want to look into his work as well. And he had this piece he said in one of his presentations that I'd watched many years ago, that traditional knowledge is not information, but rather that it is informational. Okay, because what often happens, and it's a really easy step to make because we are so conditioned and socialized to do this, is to kind of pick up Indigenous knowledge as if they are these isolate pieces, you know, just like in this kind of informational age that we live in as well, where, you know, you can go and Google something and you're expected to have an answer, or at least a half decent answer populated for you. And that's what happens in a knowledge system where you're positioned as from a rights paradigm about having the right to know something. Because something exists or something is known, I then have that right to know it. Whereas an Indigenous knowledge paradigm really works from a responsibilities framework, where it's like you have a responsibility to know these things, and with that responsibility come along these deeply embedded ethics and values of what it means to know those things. And so you don't get to know things just to know them, or just because it exists, you get to go know it, right? It doesn't quite work that way with Indigenous knowledge. And once you have come to learn something, once you have been kind of gifted that knowledge, you then have a responsibility to practicing it. And the reason that is because when we go to practice Indigenous knowledge, we actually see the health of land improve. And I don't have the statistics right in front of me, but it is somewhere around the number of 80% of the world's global diversity, right? 80% of that is exists on lands that are actively managed by Indigenous peoples, and that's around the world. So we're talking about reservations, reserves, or other land bases around the world that are managed by Indigenous peoples. And that didn't happen by mistake. That's not a fluke. It's not an exception. That is, you know, an intentional design of Native knowledge, is that we live in these reciprocal kinship-based relationships with humans and non-humans. And we can see that through that statistic that 80% then of the global diversity of this planet exists on land that is managed by Indigenous peoples. And I believe Indigenous peoples only manage about 1/4 of the surface of the earth. And so that's really phenomenal if you go to think about that. That's why it's not enough to just know something, but then it's, you have a responsibility to go and live it. And I tell my students this, that it's not about perfection or about, you know, clicking this, oh, I've got this, this, and this for Indigenous knowledge, now I'm ready to go practice it. It's a little bit more kind of complex than that. And it's not about perfection, right? And it's not about having all these 5 things that you needed to do and then be like, okay, now I can do it. It's about progress. It's about progress, not about perfection. And that's what I tell my students. And that took me a long time to realize that myself, as a steward and practitioner of this knowledge, is just to be patient with yourself and to go and to try it, and to belong to communities of practice or mentors that are willing to teach you this or learn this alongside of you. Let's see, okay, I'm going to jump back up. So this is just reflecting a little bit of what I was saying, because I still have several more things I want us to get through. But this is an important kind of setup for what we're going to talk about. And so if you are to take this on and to hold these kinship-based relationships, this will ask you to become a responsible relative and a steward of Indigenous knowledge and teach this in your classrooms, right? And so if you think about it as a responsibility framework, I hope that you will come to position yourself, if you haven't already, to see yourself as enacting a responsibility around Indigenous knowledge and carrying this into your classrooms in whatever way that you can, right? And to do it in ways that are grounded within Indigenous knowledge, and that you're also taking with it the ethics of what it means to hold Native knowledge. You're not just, cherry picking Indigenous knowledge and then squeezing it into, Western knowledge or making sense of it from a Western paradigm. It's its own sovereign, independent knowledge system, and it has its own ethics. It has its own ways and methods and methodologies for how it is to be shared and how it is to be created. And those are the things that need to get followed when you go to do this work. And it's making me think now of another resource. Maybe you probably already have this, Jennifer, but the Indigenous Research Methods book by Sean Wilson, I think would be another great resource too, for thinking more deeply about the complexities of Native knowledge systems and the value systems that are embedded in them. Okay, so to do this then, you're going to want to build relationships with Indigenous elders or experts. And I know this can be kind of daunting, but you're just trying to get to know another person, you know what I mean? It's like, we all know how to make friends, we all know how to reach out. But I will say that if you're coming to somebody to ask something of them, make sure you do bring something. Make sure you bring some tobacco, some cloth, or a basket of food. These are just these culturally appropriate protocols when you're coming to ask something of somebody. And then two, become a part of your community and land yourself, whatever that might look like. For me, it took me taking these long walks by myself in a place where I did feel safe. So you want to make sure you're safe when you're out on the land, and to be revisiting the same places or the same place or places throughout the year as much as you can. I think that in itself is such a great meditative practice that will gift a lot to you when you're coming to know land and your community. And number three, you're going to want to utilize your learning to give back to the land and to belong to the land. To say this another way, do not use knowledge or land as resource or possession. That's something I was talking about earlier about Native knowledge getting exploited. And Robin Kimmerer says this so eloquently in one of her talks. She says that, don't look at land as a set of belongings, things to be possessed or exploited, but as belonging, looking to land as belonging, as belonging there and belonging to those kinships of the land that you're on. Okay, so I'm gonna kind of keep moving us along here. I have this image here. I can't remember where I borrowed it from, but it was something I was trying to wrap my mind around this, because it's like, for me, and as many of you know, these visual models become a part of our scientific literacies, right? And about things that we need to teach our young people. And so I'm like, there are all these visuals out there that I haven't quite been satisfied with. And I came upon this one, and it feels a little bit more appropriate, or more correctly conveys the information I'm trying to get across about kinship-based relationships and sort of what a representation of Indigenous knowledge looks like, right? And so you often hear these things like, web-based or relationship building, and and those things aren't static, right? So every other visual model that I've come upon kind of paints it as a static thing, when really Indigenous knowledge is about context, it's about relationships, it's about emergence, right? And so in this visual model here, what is happening is that you're seeing connections or relationships being built, but it's also this active, moving, almost living thing. And some, these points of intersection are where those relationships are getting built and where they're emerging over time, right? So that's kind of what happens with Indigenous knowledge, is that it's not this static thing to just kind of come and know and to memorize, but it's really, when you go to story and you go to live Indigenous knowledge and to practice it with others, you have things that emerge over time, things that maybe you predicted, and things that you had no idea were going to result as a consequence of you practicing this native knowledge in these ethical kinship-based ways. So this all kind of is culminating to this point about becoming our responsibility, no matter how small or large, to attend to our kin, to our kinships, right? And then a part of that is this knowledge around our native, I have native food relatives here, but native plant relatives. Okay, so let's kind of get into some of the day-to-day or kind of the practicality of how then you take everything I just said and try to put it into these digestible pieces. And so I've put a couple of things here, and I'm going to share a few other things with you that have become really important in my practice. But one of the first things is that you're really going to want to treat plants and other human relatives, human and non-human, with consent, with respect, and reciprocity, right? When you go out to try to harvest plants or get to know them, ask their permission. And one of the things that I was told, and it's not on the slide, but one thing that I was told is like, when you go to learn from plants, they already know why you're there. And I've always been told that, you don't go harvest plants or try to approach plants when you're not feeling your best or you're not really in a good mood. Because especially when you go to harvest, that's medicine, right? That you're trying to gather and trying to use it in healing and loving ways. And so you want to make sure that you're kind of in the right frame of mind for that as well. And one basic question you can ask yourself is just, how would you get to know someone you respect or esteem? Who is that person or persons that you hold a high respect for, a high esteem for, and you'd really like to get to know them? What are some things that you would do? One thing is maybe get to know their work a little bit more deeply, invite them, whether that's inviting them to your house and I know in this time of COVID, it's different. But how then do you approach getting to know someone new? What sort of respect and care and consent do you practice when you get to know them? And all you simply do, maybe not so simply, is just, copy and paste that approach to getting to know plants. Because they're living beings as well. They have their own intelligence. They are worthy of respect and of consent and of reciprocity. And that is a fundamental piece of Indigenous knowledge, is that not only are just humans, worthy of these practices, but so are plants. And if you look to them as someone you highly esteem or respect, or someone you deeply love, how would you treat them, and how would you want other people treating them? Okay, let me go here first to this slide with Dr. Kimmerer. And I really encourage you to use this in your classroom. It's been such a huge piece of my practice with my students. It's Robin Kimmerer's The Honorable Harvest, and I can get that link out because I think there's a couple of videos out there, but either way, you'll come upon some really enlightening knowledge from Dr. Kimmerer. And these are the protocols that she's kind of outlined from a Potawatomi orientation to land and Potawatomi science about what it means to go and practice knowledge. And kind of mixed in with some things that I've kind of come to practice as well. And so what she says is that, you never pick the first, that way you never pick the last. And you take only that which is given, and you take only that what you need. And I was talking about this earlier about only harvesting when you're ready. Again, this is medicine you're gathering, and it's going to ripple outward to those who partake. And you can offer a prayer or give some sort of thanks before you harvest. And again, you can speak to the plant And you can even speak to the plant in Cheyenne or Crow. And I encourage this of all my students, native or non-native, is if you know some Indigenous language, like you should speak it. And trust me that your relationship to that plant is going to be deepened and expanded in ways than if you were to speak to it in English. And when you get, because it's a different feeling, like when I get called by my Cheyenne name or my Crow name, it sits with me differently. Like I pay attention more, and I'm like, I make sure I'm right there with whoever's trying to talk with me, as opposed to somebody who calls me by my English name, which is Marissa, and is the name I've been called the majority of my life. And so plants do feel that. And the last piece of this is that you do want to use all that you take. I want to say there was one more slide in here about protocols. Okay, maybe it's not quite there. Okay, so from here on, I do not have it in this presentation. I thought it was here, but you will want to go in and look more deeply at Dr. Robin Kimmerer's Honorable Harvest, because that's sort of a protocol that I've adapted in my classroom when we go out to look at plants, or we go outside of the school to make observations, and to, even if we're not collecting plants, we're collecting plant knowledge. And we want to make sure that we are always practicing this protocol when we go out on the land. And so here's one tool. So let's kind of get into some practical tools then, and that I use in my classroom. And you may already know of this, but it's such a great database. It's the Montana Natural Heritage Program Field Guide. And it has animals, plants, fungi, ecological systems, that you can go in and you can do a search here for it. The only thing about this is that you're going to want to make sure that you have the exact kind of name of what you're looking for. So oftentimes it might be easier to kind of Google the common name of a plant and then copy paste that Western scientific name into the search field for the field guide, because if you don't have it spelled exactly the way it exists in the database, it won't populate any results for you. And so that's what we've had to kind of do sometimes, because plants can have more than one common name, right? And so this field guide does not track all those common names for different plants. So if you want to be really sure of the plant that you're looking for, maybe go to Google first and then copy paste that Western scientific name and put it in here, and it'll populate that plant or animal for you, for example. And another really cool thing about this, well, it's free, and it is a peer-reviewed site, and I make sure to emphasize that with my students, so it's a reliable source of scientific knowledge, and that you have people who have gone out to collect this information. It's information that's been vetted, and I try to make that as kind of like another kind of teaching lesson that's embedded in this. And one of the things about this is, like, it'll give a description of the particular species you're looking at, and it also show you maps of like the range of where a particular animal or plant has been observed. And it's just such a cool site. I love it because it's, it's local to Montana, and these plants don't exist just in Montana, but it's a good way of making sure that you are going to go and talk about a plant or an animal that for certain belongs to this particular land base or landscape. And then what we've done is that we kind of researched here. We use this, they populate great photos of the plant as well, so you're getting like the correct photo of a particular plant. That's not always possible on something like Google. You never know what you're gonna get there necessarily, and so it's just a really great go-to resource when you're wanting to look more, especially at plants. So here are some kind of, and I'm going to bring us back around to this in just a second. I just wanted to showcase it. And right now I want to kind of get more into then what designing plant learning might look like when utilizing Indigenous knowledge or Indigenous science. Number one, you're going to want to know whose ancestral territory you're on. And ancestral means like deep time. And so I'm not talking about like present day reservations. I'm talking about the ancestral belonging of Indigenous people. So like for Cheyenne, for example, we are on like a very small plot of land of what used to be a really expansive territory for us. And it went clear up into Alberta and all the way down to like North Texas. And, you know, those are like those wide ranging territories. And again, territory isn't taken up from an Indigenous paradigm as the same way it is within a Western paradigm about, you know, land ownership. And these are the lines of what it means for this country or this particular territory or people to exist on this land. We don't belong to land in those terms. And so a lot of this becomes like, you know, shared territories as well. But it's important to know about whose ancestral territory you're on, and where this land-based learning that you're going to engage in with plants is about to take place. Number two, you're also going to want to think about who are the native knowledge or science experts in your area. You can, you know, get to know them, invite them to guest speak to your class, and please, please be prepared to culturally receive them. How would you want your dearest one treated if they were visiting? And one of the culturally appropriate ways is that, you know, you can provide a gift or a stipend for these folks. And, you know, when you invite somebody, they are going to be really eager to share knowledge, and just let them, that's their free space to design what the learning needs to look like for that time. And so, you know, just be respectful and inviting, and make sure that, again, you are prepared to like culturally appropriately receive them. And if you don't know what that means, I would go ask a friend who's done this and ask them what they've done and how their practice has been received by guest speakers. Number three, so these are a couple of things you can do. And then number three, when you're going to actually go do like a land walk around plants, which I'll get into here in a second, you're going to want to review a guide or a template for how to approach plants, kind of like a plant protocol, so that you're clear with your students of how you will treat plants on the walk. So it feeds into what I'd referred to earlier about, you know, making sure like you're in a good place, like, you know, kind of emotionally or mentally, and that you go out and you ask permission, you treat plants with consent, respect, reciprocity. And please, again, look into The Honorable Harvest by Dr. Kimmerer. We use that when we go out on our land walks, and to kind of get students in the mind space and mental space of what it means to go out and culturally interact with plants ethically, and to engage with them in these ethically kinship-based ways that, you know, all come back around to treating plants with consent, with respect, with reciprocity. And you can go on these land walks even just around the school to make observations of plants and other natural phenomenon, for example, the season, the temperature, clouds, etc., and try to identify or name as many plants as you can. And of course, this will kind of differ for the age group you work with, and it'll emerge and it'll design itself while you're out there. And my best advice to you is to just you know, have students within you know, sight, have them in sight, because we are responsible for their safety. And at the same time, do your best not to restrict them. Just let them go, let them observe, let them kind of organically form that relationship to plants without kind of policing or monitoring their behavior. And it's really fascinating what happens in a space like that. And once you've kind of done that, you can bring those observations back into the classroom and have students research their plant relatives in more detail, like, for example, using that Natural Heritage Program site and a couple of other sources I'm going to share here, so that they're deepening their knowledge around a particular plant relative or relatives. Okay, so here are some examples that I've designed, and I got to try to, let's see, I have another window open. that I want to share with you, if my computer will let me. Okay. Okay, so we have kind of migrated over to kind of like Google Classroom and the Google Suite at Lander School. And so I've been trying to, especially with, you know, having to go to remote learning with COVID. So some of this exists here then. And so here's like something that you could use, just creating like a list, and they can write down the name of the plant. And the idea here is to like, maybe even they give a description of the plant, or maybe they have family names for the plant, or a common name, you know, just what is that, you know, just, it's really important to let students form their own kind of relationship or naming system or description or interaction with a particular plant. And again, for age groups, this will vary. But I think it's really important that you kind of let them make that meaning and make sense of these plant relatives on their own. And so when I go out with them, that's what I tell them. I say, you know, you can describe it. Do you have a particular family name that your family has come up with for specific plants? Do you know an English common name? Do you know the name of the plant in a native language, etc.? So it's really about letting them kind of construct their own meaning making and naming with this, because that becomes their entry point into this learning. Okay, if I go to this next one, something that you can expand upon too, hopefully, let me see if I can zoom it in a little bit, is like, you can look at the English common name of the plant, and I said this can be a family name too. What's the Cheyenne name? And I'll get into a resource for that here in a second for you all. What's the Western scientific name, meaning its genus and species? And then just trying to get them to pay attention to some details of like the structure or form of the plant. You know, is it, you know, a monocot or dicot? How does it reproduce? You know, is it monoecious or dioecious? What's the range of this? And again, all of this is about consolidating different resources. And one is that Montana Natural Heritage Program site I showed you. And I'm going to show you a few more in just a minute. And then describing the Cheyenne culture uses of this plant. And so I do have access to a Cheyenne Ethnobotany book that Linwood Tallbull gave to me. And so it's not like this printed, widely available book. So if you are interested in something like this, I can try to reach out to him and see if it's something, if I'd have his permission to share it with you all, because it's not my book, it's his dad's book. And I'd be happy to reach out on your behalf to see if he'd be willing to share that. And then again, you know, when's the best time to harvest this plant? And then I also asked them to sketch a photo of sketch the plant or take a photo, or they can borrow a photo from the Natural Heritage Program field guide site. I really try to encourage them. It depends on how much time you have, right? Because we all have to adapt in our classroom. So if there is time, I do ask them to try to sketch it. And I by no means am an artist at all. So I would be really self-conscious about having to draw something as well. I know my kids can kind of get that way, but I tell them it's, you know, I'm not asking for perfection. It's just, it's a more intimate way of getting to know the plant and its structure. Because, you know, just getting a photo is a really passive process. It doesn't really require you to study or go in depth with the plant. So again, it just kind of comes down to how much time you might have. And so what you're doing here in this activity is kind of creating almost like a profile or just some basic information about a particular plant relative by integrating native knowledge and Western knowledge and how they might kind of approach what becomes important about a plant. And so one of the places that I want to try to get my own practice to and with my students too is creating a story about the plants that they come across, because that's a huge Indigenous pedagogy is, we learn about things through story. We don't necessarily learn about things in isolation from each other or through sort of a reductionist approach. And that's an approach of Western science. I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just saying it's a different approach to coming to learn about something. And for me, at least, I know a story stays with me longer about a plant and its uses than trying to like boil it down to like maybe like a checklist or kind of this like information that's kind of isolated from each other in like a list form. And so, it's just a lot of this is just kind of experimenting too and seeing what lands with students. And so I found this to be a really great activity. This is really similar to the previous one I just shown you. Let me see here. So as you can kind of take away from the two previous documents I showed you, it's really about just the plant. And so when you feel like your students are ready or you're ready to take it to the next step, with Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous science, Indigenous approaches to learning and knowing, it's not learning about things in isolation from each other. It's also thinking about the kinships that they belong to. So this was like the next part of the activity that we did, was then to think about who are the closest relative of a plant. So for example, who are the closest relative of sage? Who are the closest relatives of rose hips? And some of these students also then focus maybe on the fox or red fox or like a white-tailed deer or elk. So it was really open. It didn't have to just center around plants, but getting them to think about how these relatives exist within a kinship, not on their own, because that's not how the land works, but who are their closest relatives and what do those relationships and interactions look like on a regular basis. And then one more I want to share with you. The kids thought this was really fun. And I thought it was really fun too. It really required me to exercise my brain, my little teacher brain. But like we went through this and, I said, I'm a conifer, I grow tall, my leaves form on my branches in a spiral or whorl-like pattern, and the leaves are needle-like. I reproduce using a female and male cones, thus I am monoecious, and the biggest hint of all, I'm harvested and used as teepee poles by Northern Cheyenne and other Indigenous peoples of the Great Plains. And I say, who am I? And so some of you may already know this, but it's the lodgepole pine. And then other ones, this one says, I'm a flowering dicot plant belonging to the class Dicotyledon, and I can be found everywhere. I have white flowers, my leaves look like a squirrel's tail. And these are all hints, right, that I'm dropping for them because I've gone over this information about these plants with them like in previous lessons. And so I think they had a lot of fun with this one. And I had a lot of fun with it too, because it was just another way to try to get them to engage their plant knowledge. Let me see if I can move back. Let's see here. Okay, so that was just some of the ideas that I've come up with so far around plants in my classroom with students. I've also been a part of designing outdoor programs that take place in the summer, and those allow you to be a little bit more immersed in the land and outdoors a little bit more. But just because we are within classrooms doesn't mean we can't always get outside, just even if it's just right outside the school door, to go find these plants, because we did this several weeks ago, maybe a couple months ago now actually, and there were so many plants that we identified that were just by the school. It was really amazing. Okay, so here are some great resources, and I'll name them off one by one, starting on the left. The first one is, if you want to learn more about plants and native knowledge about plants, it's A Taste of Heritage, Pro-Indian Recipes and Herbal Medicine by Elma Hogan Snell. Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Kimmerer. The Sous Chef's Indigenous Kitchen. And this one is going to have, this one is going to have like recipes, which is really cool, by Chef Sean Sherman. And then there's the Cheyenne Dictionary, and you can go online here And it's really comprehensive database of Cheyenne language. And you can also click on it, click on a good chunk of the words, a majority of the words for their pronunciation. And you can go, there's like a Cheyenne to English format for it, or an English to Cheyenne format. I also teach this course in the spring. It's an online course through Montana State University of Bozeman, and you can find more information on it just by Googling that, and it should come up. And here's a few other books. This Native American Ethnobotany, I think of it more like as an index or an encyclopedia about Indigenous knowledge, because that's kind of how it's framed. So it's going to give you this very like cataloged information about how different tribes might use a particular plant. And sometimes it's useful. It doesn't give you the whole story, but it does give you some useful information. In this one here, Plants Have So Much to Give Us, All We Have to Do Is Ask. It's a fairly new book. I just got it myself, and what I've read so far, it's really enlightening. It's about the author writes about her knowledge of plants, and I want to, and she's Anishinaabe, and about what her mentor kind of walked through with her. So she's kind of demonstrating like her pathway, or sort of an Indigenous pedagogy for how she learned her plant knowledge. And this book here called Tending the Wild, Native American Knowledge and the Management of California's Natural Resources. It does have a focus on California's, California's Native people, but there's so much useful information there. I would definitely get your hands on this and take a read. Very well done narrative about how the Native peoples of California interact with land and with plants. Here is another resource. This is online. It's called Learning in Places. It's a collaborative network of educators, families, and community partners who are working to cultivate equitable, culturally thriving socio-ecological systems, learning and ethical decision-making, using field-based science education in outdoor places, including gardens for children in pre-K to third grade and their families. I know that they say pre-K to third grade, but I've used some of their resources for my high school classroom and still found it really productive. So I know that that's what their focus is here, but it can definitely be expanded on. And so it's learningplaces.org. And a key principal investigator of this work is Dr. Megan Bang, and her work is just phenomenal. So definitely you can look into Learning in Places, and you can look into more work that she's published to really not only think about Native plant knowledge, but about the Indigenous pedagogies and the Indigenous value systems and axiologies that go along with knowing Native knowledge. And then this one here is a kind of a video series I kind of stumbled upon. It's on PBS. It's the Tending the Wild. It's going to be on kset.org. It's from California, but it's such a great resource. There's an episode on basketry. There's one on cultural burning, and lots of really, really cool stuff. So definitely check that out. Okay, so I do have a few more slides, but I'm also recognizing the time. So Jennifer, if it works for you, I can kind of pass it back to you if there's questions, and if not, then I can present on a few other slides that I have here.
Why don't you just keep presenting for now for at least another 3 minutes or so, and the relationship piece is just, it's really striking me tonight, Marissa, and I keep thinking of that. And then my dear teacher Robin Klein actually just put a comment in chat that said this is all so awesome. And Robin was teaching at the Montana State University Masters of Science and Science Education Ethnobotany program. That was my introduction to ethnobotany. So very cool to see.
Awesome.
Related. And all of these resources, by the way, folks, I am writing these down. I will add all of these to the resource list tomorrow. But yeah, why don't you for a few more minutes keep on going, and then we'll get to the questions and answers. So if you do have any questions and answers, please feel free to start populating the Q&A portion of that's down at the bottom of your screen, and we'll do our best to answer all of the questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Jennifer. Okay. So let me go ahead and go into a few more slides here. This is one thing that I encourage, anybody, regardless of the learning environment you're working in. But one of the key pieces of Indigenous knowledge that is critical to it is that, non-humans can be looked to as teachers. And so from an Indigenous paradigm, you don't just learn from other humans, like learning is also possible, that humans can learn from non-humans, right? And so here, an example is looking to maybe the bison as a teacher. And here are a few things to know about bison. Bison is that they can roam up to 32 miles a day. They only eat the grass within a few inches or so of the ground, and then they move on. So these are highly intelligent and intentional animals who don't overgraze an area. They kind of know when it's time to stop and then to move on. And their ability to carry on such a huge range of 32 miles a day definitely helps in that. And their wallowing behavior when they're kind of taking a mud bath, if you will, and I would definitely Google a video of that. It's really fascinating to watch. It contributes to soil and plant disturbance in really good ways. And the question you're left with at the end of this, with not just the buffalo, but with any other relative, is that they know their responsibilities. Like they just know them. They already just know how they're supposed to live in their kinship-based relationships. And how can we learn from them about how we can participate in our kinships? Like what does that then look like for us? What are we supposed to be doing as humans to give to our kin, particularly to our local kin that we're a part of? So it's definitely a piece you can take into your classroom. I heavily encourage you to do so. Okay, recipes and uses. All right, so I'll just give a few examples here. One for some recipes and how it's used is that the prairie rose or the rosa arkansana. I'm not particularly strong with my Latin, but what you can do with the rose hip is that its fruit is harvested in winter or after maybe the first frost and then is eaten. And its stems are scraped off the bark, and you can use this bark as tea, and you can use the roots as tea as well. And you can just kind of keep a root with you. Like it's not just good for one use, you can use it for multiple uses. And it's high in vitamin C. And then the Cheyenne name for this is hitnin. And I wanted to just give a couple of images here. You can look at the flower and how to identify what the prairie rose flower looks like, because there are other species that belong to genus Rosa, and they look really similar, and they can be used in similar ways, but this is the actual plant relative that exists here locally. So, it's said that the benefits of a rose hip tea is that it can improve your immunity, has one of the highest levels of vitamin C. You can have maybe improved heart health, heart health, and prevent cell damage from free radicals or high antioxidants, may help reduce inflammation and pain, and can aid in weight loss. And there's an antioxidant called telluroside, which may have fat burning properties, but it's pretty straightforward for its preparation. You can place 1 to 2 teaspoons of dried rose hips in an infuser or tea bag, let it steep for 10 to 15 minutes. And you do want this one to steep for quite a long time to really pull out its profile and its characteristics. And it is a bit tart, so if you're not really feeling that, you can put in a sweetener like honey, and it's really delicious. You can have it hot or cold, and it's just in general just really yummy. And I always want to talk about yarrow too, because this is such a important, significant relative that has taken care of many communities and in many nations, not just Cheyenne or Crow, and not just on this continent, but on others as well. It's often referred to as kind of like a blood stop. And what you do with it is you can take these leaves here, and I've heard them referred to as like a squirrel's tail. They almost look like a squirrel's tail, and you can chew it up. And let's say you have a scrape on your hand or a cut, and you chew it up, but be careful, it is quite bitter. And then you put it directly on the wound, and it helps the blood stop, and that's why they call it blood stop. But I've also heard it referred to kind of as cough medicine as well, because its flowers and stems can be used to make a tea to help with coughing. And it can also be used like topically in some sort of oil, could be olive oil, coconut oil, any sort of kind of carrier oil to treat dry skin as well, including like things like eczema. I know me and my daughter kind of have to do that with the dry skin a little bit, and this helps. So I just wanted to give like a little more close-up photo of yarrow. And so here's what it looks like with the flowers, and here is the leaves. And the fascinating thing about this is that these leaves, as you see here, can grow directly from the ground. It doesn't have to be on this long stem of the plant, which they are there, but it can also just grow directly in from the ground like this. And it's going to be a similar process. You're going to want to steep it for preparation, steep it for about 10 to 15 minutes, and you can drink up to 3 cups a day. It's said that you can drink it hot to break a fever. And then you can also make it as like a tincture as well, which is just a more concentrated kind of, I guess, ingestible product than making a tea. It contains flavonoids and alkaloids, which are these plant compounds that are known to relieve digestive complaints that are present in yarrow as well. Let's see what else I've got here. Okay, I'll review one more, Jennifer, and then I'll turn it back over to you if that works. I really appreciate purple coneflower too. It's another wonderful plant medicine, plant relative that really, takes care of us. It can be used as a remedy for sore mouth, gums, or throat. Its leaves and roots can be steeped to make a tea. And the same process can be used with an oil to make a topical cream to relieve like a sore neck and muscles. And you can chew on the root directly to relieve a mild throat or to relieve the throat or a mild toothache. And the root is powerful and has similar effects as Novocaine. Of course, it's not as potent, but it does have similar characteristics where it kind of has that numbing effect. And so again, you can make a tea, you can make a topical treatment, and it's going to be similar, to its preparation. It's not going to be the tastiest of the teas, so you might want to think about mixing it with something like a rosehip, yarrow, or elderberry to kind of balance it. 1 to 2 teaspoons of the flowers, leaves, and roots per cup, and you can let it steep for about 15 minutes. Again, feel free to add honey to make it a little bit more palatable. And it, echinacea or purple coneflower is a popular remedy for colds, flu, and other infections. It may help improve immunity, and it will have a little bit of that tingling effect on the tongue because of that. It's like ability to kind of act as a little bit of a numbing agent, and that's going to come from the root. That comes from the root, not from the stem or the leaves, but from the root. And another, common name for it is you can call it black root because its root is black. And I've heard it referred to as purple coneflower, as black root. And so that's where, common names will vary. And it's useful to, especially when you're researching these plants, to maybe get the genus and species to make sure you're talking about the correct relative. Okay, well, Jennifer, I'm going to leave it there, and if there's any questions, I'd love to answer them.
Sure. Thank you so much. And I was frantically writing down the the Cheyenne words. So in the captions, I'm hoping to capture those.
Perfect. Yes, and they're right on the slide too.
And with respect, you know, I think it's so important to put native language out there, but this is incredible. I am so excited. And I know we could absolutely do a whole 6-series workshop on just plants alone. And I hope that we have the opportunity to do ethnobotany part 2. So folks, hang in there for those of you who were wishing that we had done more of the plant identification, but really, you know, what we're here for is to learn how to teach this and to really embrace, you know, especially when it comes to traditional knowledges, you know, how to talk about these things with the greatest of respect, and how to share them with your students. So we do have 3 great questions. I love all of these questions that we have so far. Please feel free to add. We've got 10 whole minutes. And if you do need to bug out early, the feedback survey is open. Please be reminded that the survey is only open for 24 hours though. So here's our first question. Thinking about ethical harvest of plants. I'm curious how or if rules of the reciprocity and taking only what you need, etc., might apply to invasive species. And I actually had thought of a similar question as you were talking about, you know, talking to the plants first, or, you know, giving them, gifting them, making sure that they're ready, you're ready. And I'm thinking, you know, when I get really frustrated sometimes after a meeting, and I would go out to my garden and I would weed. And I was thinking, well, that's not bad. That wasn't very, you know, respectful of the plants. But how do we deal with invasive species as relatives?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. And that's, you know, something I definitely question myself about too, and continuously do. And so here's where I've come with it so far, is that for me, I don't think it's necessarily about like labeling a plant as invasive, but really looking at the plant behaving invasively. And invasive also is tied back to like the human responsibility and human interaction with particular plant communities or relatives. And we do need to acknowledge that there are plants, even native plants, that can behave invasively. And that's where like these stewardship practices, whether it's, you know, weeding or cultural burning, that can help alleviate some of that. And so I try to keep that into consideration, because these plants are still relatives too, right? And how do you treat them with respect and reciprocity? And it's a way where I've come down to it so far is just like, if they're behaving invasively, they do need some sort of human attendance to that, to kind of restore balance. And it is a part of the responsibility to do that. And I don't know if that answers the question. If you want to push back on that, I'm happy to answer more.
Well, I wanted to make room for, you know, very specifically, I wanted to get rid of the kochia, the hound's tongue, and the cheatgrass to make room for wildflowers, and specifically, you know, native to Montana wildflowers to encourage pollinators. And it did take about 6 weeks in my new yard to get pollinators to show up once they started, once the flowers started blooming. So I like that is, yes, they are invasive. Yes, they are still relatives, but we need to sometimes make room for the relatives that benefit more species. So I think you nailed that one. The next one is also, this is a great question also. I do my harvest at an organic grocery store. Me too. And so from already harvested plants, how would you recommend, you know, treating them with respect and reciprocity?
100%. And so that is kind of the challenge here, right? Is because we are so embedded in this like capitalist industrial ag kind of system. And how do you give thanks for that? I think that's up to a kind of an individual kind of decision making, but it, you know, in my practice, I, you know, just try to give thanks and acknowledge where the food came from, and still try to practice the honorable harvest. And what that comes to look like for different people at different times of the years is up to you. And again, it's not about perfection and about meeting all of this right now, but about being about progress and about learning, because it's complex, right? And by no means do I want to try to call out anybody's actions, because we all have real lives to live within a real kind of infrastructure that we're a part of that's tied to fossil fuels. The honorable harvest is still very much possible with it though too.
I completely concur. And, I've listened to Chef Sean Sherman and some, and many other chefs, as cooking is one of my favorite pastimes. And I feel like, just respecting the food and respecting the ingredients, I hear that a lot on the various cooking shows, but I really think that there's so much to that, because when you're honoring, for instance, I did the cedar braised pronghorn instead of bison out of Chef Sean Sherman's book, there we go. And, just respecting that animal, knowing its story, knowing how it was harvested. And, then the cedar, I harvested the cedar in the mountains near here. And, I think we can definitely, as we go to the grocery store, just be thinking about, and then as you expressed earlier as well, that not wasting, using what it is that you get and being very intentional about using those things and treating them as sacred too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was just talking about this with my students the other day too, about how the relationship is different to a food relative or a plant relative when you go out to harvest it yourself, as opposed to just jumping in the car to get down to the grocery store and there it is. It does set up a different relationship for sure.
This is a nice question. What has been a moment of learning with your students that stands out in your memory as one of the best?
Oh man, how do I choose here? Well, just in general, they're just really awesome. And I feel blessed and honored to go to work with them every day. I think one of the most meaningful moments was when they begin to kind of put this knowledge together for themselves and ask really critical, insightful questions. And one of them was like, we were thinking about like the age of the earth and all of the things that have happened over billions of years. And one student asking me like, where did all the water go? Like if there was like this big ice age and things like that. And just when they start to think about things in a bigger picture like that, feels really, really rewarding. So I'm blessed.
Well, I can, when I think about my favorite experiences on the landscape, it's been with all of you. It's been with Linwood Tallbull and you and Leo Bird and Tim Ryan and Shane Doyle, and walking the landscape and learning from all of you really stands out. Being on the land with people whose ancestors literally make up the soil. The DNA is in the soil from the ancestors. That's so powerful. And when you can share that, from your own culture with children from your own culture, that's such a beautiful thing. What a wonderful opportunity.
100%. Well said.
So the last question here, and then we will be wrapping up. Can you share the PowerPoint with us? Folks would love to investigate some more.
Yeah, definitely.
Great.
For sure.
I'll get that from you. I'll send you a Google Drive link where you can, upload it into the Google Drive, and I'll add the Google Drive link to the resources. Again, I'll be adding all of the resources for all of the wonderful authors and researchers that Marissa has talked about. And I just really do, I want to thank you so much for the content and the thoughtfulness of this presentation. I think it's so important as we look at things like ethnobotany and really anything within the science, teaching science realm. We're really having to step out of the Western epistemology and the Western science epistemology to really embrace and consider that people who have been on a landscape and have a language that's based on the land and based on all of the things within that landscape, that's a different way of seeing and understanding, and that emphasis on the transference of knowledge rather than the acquisition of knowledge, information versus informational. I think it's so very important if we can go forward with our students with open minds and open hearts to develop more relationships with the precious things around us. I think, we can have a really positive effect on each other and on our landscapes. And I really appreciated it.
Absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much, Jennifer. And I keep seeing that somebody's raising their hand. Kara, I don't know if.
Yeah, unfortunately, we do have to. We're right at 5:30, and
okay.
Kara, if you email us your questions, I will make sure to get those to Marissa. The feedback survey is open, and next month we have Annie and Loja, and I am so excited about their presentation. And of course, they're both students of Robin Kimmerer, so I think you've heard Robin Kimmerer's name now throughout all of the presentations. But I thank you so much. I thank all of you. I hope you're safe out there this winter. Have a wonderful holiday season. And I hope to see you back here in January. Thank you all very much.
Thank you all so much. Take care, everybody.